Let's move on. Seeking a game. And yeah, it's taking us longer to find 5-minute games at this level. I've decided that we're going to go approximately until 2,500. Because I think... Yeah, SRP, thank you. Van Hargraves. Okay. Oh, we already played this guy. So let's go E4. And he plays the karo-kann. Now, against the karo-kann, there's many good lines, but one very, let's say, pure line that I like to showcase is the 2 knights. We just developed both of our knights, and he goes bishop g4. Brandon, thank you for the sub. Now, against bishop g4, the theoretical continuation is to first play h3. Okay, he takes on f3, and we get the 2 bishops. Now, how should we position our pieces? Well, what do you guys think we should do here? Yeah. We have several possibilities here. One possibility is to fianchetto the bishop. So we can actually either play it with d3 or d4. So think of it this way. If you play d3, that obstructs the diagonal for the bishop. So then we're going to have to fianchetto the bishop. Or the move that I like to play is d4. That's simple. And it's an old school move. Now, what should we take with? And now it's time for us to experiment a little bit. So taking with the queen protects the pawn. But if we were to play in tall-like fashion, we would take with a knight. We're going to play this in my style. This is not entirely sound. But why are we sacrificing a pawn? Because we have a lead in development, and we have the 2 bishops. And this combination of factors, to me, particularly in a blitz game, gives quite a bit of compensation. Also, his queen is stuck in the middle, where it can be assailed by certain pieces. We can develop a tempo. That doesn't mean you immediately should. I think that black can neutralize my initiative with accurate play, but to play accurately here is certainly not easy at all. And this is, again, the judgment call that I'm making. Now, having said A, you have to say B, as the Russian expression goes. And B means sacrificing another pawn on B2. If he takes that pawn, his queen gets even further into my territory. And I can use that. Okay, so he smartly dips his queen back. But what move is now possible? I'll talk about this after the game. I'll explain why queen takes b2 is not that good for black. Well, now we can castle. Exactly. Look how quickly we're developing. We have pressure down the d-file. You guys should just visually be able to see the compensation. Okay. Now, one of the hardest things about attacking in these positions is finding ways to just keep twisting the knife in. So one way to think about it is this. Trades in general are good for him. So this knight on e4, we only have 1 knight left. Which is why I want to keep it, right? If he trades the knight, we won't have any like screwdriver pieces. Now we got to think about where we want to put this knight. We don't want to dip it back to c3. That would be passive. So can we find any more active squares for the knight? And what I'm not going to tell you guys right now is that seeing this move and playing it hinges on seeing a sacrifice. Because you guys might look at this and say, well, wait a second, can't he chase the knight away with h6? But in this position, because all of our pieces are nicely deployed, you should already be looking for sacrifices and tactical ideas. That should not be a surprise to anyone that these kinds of things already kind of exist. Now, it's harder to actually find the type of sacrifice, but the fact that they exist shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And h6 weakens the g6 square. We'll get into that after the game. He didn't do it. He went knight e5. Okay, not a problem. He actually helps us by opening up the d-file. We just need to find a good square for the queen. And a good square would be somewhere out of the way of the other pieces. And g3 comes to mind. It's out of the way. It doesn't stumble in front of the other pieces, but at the same time, it does a lot. Controls the diagonal, and it buttresses the knight, which is an important piece. Let's see if he takes the bishop. We're going to pre-move rook takes d3. F4 would be a little bit more in the face, right? And it would walk into ideas like knight d5, potentially. I'm not saying you would have done that. But potentially a queen on f4 would also interfere with the bishop's control of the knight. So, okay, bishop d6. This is another reason why we put the queen on g3. Because now we can better deal with this pin. If we put the queen on f4, it would be harder for us to deal with the pin. But we got to be very, very careful. A lot of people, I'm sure, are thinking bishop f4. But bishop f4 walks into knight to h5. That's an important detail to account for. So instead of bishop f4, we are going to play f4, which is actually not like an ideal move, but at least our pawn now supports the knight, and we continue the initiative. In such positions, you have to keep it going. Sometimes the attack won't work out immediately. But if you can keep the pressure on your opponent, if you can keep the foot on the gas pedal, eventually something's going to give. And you got to believe that. That's why this is also kind of fun. You're living on the edge here. I don't think this is entirely objectively sound, but I do believe that my opponent's eventually going to fold over. Let's double the rooks. Yep, bring the rook into the game. Knight d5, though, is a very strong defensive resource, although I have a response planned for it. Okay, so knight d5, let's think of this move in terms of its drawbacks. The drawback of the move knight d5 is that it weakens the e4 square, actually. So we can dip our knight back to e4, pressuring the bishop on d6. Now, you guys might look at this and say, well, wait a second. Aren't you allowing bishop takes f4, which is probably what he's going to play, which leads to mass trades? And the short answer is yes, I am, but I've calculated this line a little bit further. So let's see what happens. We have to trade queens. But believe it or not, in my opinion, that's not as big of a problem as it seems. Because where can our rook now go? We can go rook to d7. Now, I have to give compliments to my opponent. He's playing this like a GM. He's playing extremely well. He's beating back my attack. But now in the endgame, we still have an initiative. We have a rook on the 7th. We're 2 pawns down. We're going to win one of the pawns back. He might also capture the pawn on g2, but his knight might get in trouble. So it's unclear. We have piece activity. We still have an initiative in the endgame. But this isn't necessarily what I was looking for. But this is also what I talked about. If you keep on keeping on, your opponent is eventually going to get tired. And that's literally a thing. So what do we want to accomplish in a position like this? Well, ideally, we want both rooks to be on the 7th rank. That's called piggies on the 7th. Well, can we get that done? Can we get that done? We can go c4, but there's a problem with c4. He goes knight e3. I want you guys to follow carefully. He goes knight e3. And then he can potentially come back and take the pawn. So can we prepare the move c4? I know this looks lame. But, and there's several ways to do it, but we're going to go b3. And in addition to preparing rook d7, we're also building a potential pawn chain. So even if we don't get our rook to d7 and we do play c4, that pawn on c4 is independently of anything else just going to be protected. And when you have these types of endgames where both knights are kind of, hacking away at each other's pawns, it's a very good idea to make sure that you have as many pawns on protected by other pawns as possible. I don't know if that makes sense, but he doesn't actually prevent us from getting the rook to d7. So in the endgame, you can think of the position as a function of two main things, piece activity and material. And people tend to underestimate the role of piece activity. People tend to prioritize counting up the material in the endgame, and that's completely understandable because it is important. But don't forget that piece activity can be an absolute game changer. What do we do now? How do we keep on pressuring his position, right? We need to get to his king. What's stopping us from getting to his king? Well, the immediate target is the f-pawn. So we can go knight g5. Knight d6 would have done the same thing. Now, it is true that he also is trying to get to our king, but he doesn't have enough firepower to do that because his f8 rook is passive. He's opened up the a file, which is a good thing. But we are ready to take on f7 and cut open an immediate artery to his king. And then the tactics begin. So, yeah, I know. We're 21-35. We're moving right along, making progress. I never call the knights horses. So rook d8 is a good move. And, well, we got to think about whether we want to trade rooks. Do we want to trade rooks? And if not, how do we avoid the trade of rooks? Okay, I got to make a move, guys. I've got no time. So rook to c7. We do not want to trade rooks because we want to keep the piggies on the 7th. And we are actually threatening a really cool tactical idea. Does anybody see what white is threatening here? Okay, that's not a problem. Okay, he actually defends, so let's go g4, defending the pawn. We're still threatened. Knight takes c6 is correct, and if he takes, he gets checkmated. I hope that he lets us do it. Now, the reason we shouldn't be afraid of this is he just doesn't have enough pieces in the attack. Right? He doesn't have enough to really do anything to my king, and the king has this escape route should that be necessary. And actually, I'm going to exploit that escape route. Watch my king. Now the king is actually an asset, not a weakness. The king actually, kind of like that goalkeeper, which goes in to kick the corner, is now an asset. I'm threatening a similar idea. Ooh, and now a beautiful idea to win the game. Somebody name it for me. Bingo. Actually, I got to be a little careful. I think I cut this a little bit too close. One sec. Okay, mate. That's where that's where I come in. You know, don't try this at home. All right. Don't try this at home. I got a little bit nervous there. I think I cut it too close when I was trying to get people to find knight h6. Okay. So he plays the karo-kann. Now the karo-kann was named after two people, Ilya Khan, I think, and Horatio Karo. So it's the Karo-Khan. It wasn't one person. And nor do I think they worked together. I think Karo and Khan sort of independently developed the system. And karo-kann was first played in the year 1845. Karo in 1886 played it, but he was only like the 10th or... Oh, Khan played it before Karo. But before either Karo or Khan played it, there were a couple of other players who played it. Some guy named Weiss played it 5 times in 1883. R. Kleiman, thank you. So, you know, again, it's one of those things where it's not that people didn't play this before Karo and Khan. It's just that they perhaps were the ones that played it most consistently. And, you know, probably they also wrote some sort of treatise on the karo-kann. So that's why this came to be known as the karo-kann. And this is most similar to the French. It's what I would call it's basically you prepare d5. There's 2 moves where you prepare d5 and the other one is e6. It's a modern opening and it's very, very popular. It's withstood the test of time and it's a very good opening. Good night, Anu. Yep, absolutely. So I decided to play the 2 knights, right? Developing both knights. He goes for the bishop g4 system. His idea is to give up his bishop first and then go e6. Why didn't he go e6 immediately? Because then the bishop would be stuck behind the pawn chain. This would be very passive. Thank you, Zach Miller priming. Appreciate it. All pawns and no hope is right. The French is not bad. So here I played d4. This is an old school move. I think nowadays people tend to prefer g3, bishop g2, and then d3. So you don't claim as much of the center, but the center you do claim is very well protected. So the drawback of d4 is precisely that he can play d takes d4. There was a famous Fischer-Tal game in this line. Now queen takes e4 does protect the pawn. Yeah, the system is viable against the French, but it's not quite as good. And knight f6. Yeah, so if he goes bishop h5, there is a very sharp line where basically white gets a big initiative by giving a check and slamming the knight into e5. This line is considered to be very dangerous for black, although there's a lot of theory here. I don't want to delve into that, but that's why he took on f3. Thank you, Dragon Transformer, another sub with the prime. But I decided to play knight takes e4. So from a purely objective perspective, this is not a very sound sacrifice, although it's not bad. I think it's not terribly unsound either. But after knight f6, our opponent lets us develop a tempo. And now we castle. And here, actually, I'm not sure about the move that I played, knight g5. I was kind of attracted to the idea of sacking on e6. But I think that it would have been better to be prophylactic. So our opponent wants to go knight e5. Oh, yeah, queen takes b2. Sorry, I forgot about that. So if queen takes b2, we simply castle. And I just want you guys to visually compare the development of white and the development of black. Thank you, Moksha Nirvana, for the 300. Right? White's got literally everything developed. Black has virtually nothing developed. And once I go rook b1 and rook takes b7, black is just basically going to get checkmated. Even if black manages to castle short, it actually won't matter because of the firepower that white has here. Really, it isn't about the pawns. All pawns and no hope, as one wise man said. Does that make sense? So again, we can delve into the detail here, but you guys should really just see this from a visual perspective above all else. So he dips back. And here I actually think I was impatient. Now, our opponent wants knight to e5. He wants to trade off this bishop on d3, which is sort of a very important cog in the machine. could you guys propose a move whereby I can both prevent knight e5, but to do so while also improving my position in a tangible way? $3 from Zenith Soundbite, thank you. Well, I'll have to do that later after the speedrun concludes. So bishop c4 is possible. Queen g3, very good move. And as is, yeah, good job, guys. Bishop d4 also good, because that would centralize the bishop. Okay, that would centralize 54.75. Look at that. That's a sexy number, if I may say so myself. So yeah, that would have been good. I kind of missed this move, to be honest. Now, if he played h6, this weakens the g6 square. And there's a very thematic idea. Actually, Gary Kasparov once fell into this against Deep Blue. And just look at how badly the king is placed. We can bring the rook into the game and x-ray the king. Black can very easily get checkmated in a position like this. Now, I know a lot of people are looking at this and saying, wait a second, why not bishop c5? And this is a piece of advice I have for everybody. Be very careful, very, very careful, not to underestimate the amount of pieces that you are giving away in return for the queen. Okay, this is something I see all the time. Like people will find some crazy sequence of where I'm winning, and then they'll give up 2 rooks and 3 pieces and 5 pawns for the queen. Right? There, you can collect sufficient material for the queen, and this is a case of that. You have a rook and 2 pieces for the queen, and white's attack kind of fizzles out. There's no need for this. It's much better to just accumulate, prepare slowly, attack fast, rather than do something like that. Okay. Well, no, I didn't have this idea here. First and foremost because... Well, actually, maybe I did. Ooh. Actually, that's not so bad. No, but he can move his queen away. This is actually funny, because if f takes c6, you can do this. But the same thing applies here. Black has 1,000,000 pieces for the queen. So this isn't that good. Yeah, so queen g3 instead. Bishop d6 is a very good move. Now, if bishop f4... Knight h5 forks the bishop and the queen, leading to a lot of problems. Yeah, and I gotta attribute that to my coach Lep Sahis. So we go f4. And actually here, I think there was a critical moment. So queen c7 is good. And now knight d5, super annoying. And this is a very typical thing in the karo-kann that happens, right? He gets this stronghold on d5, which shuts down the d-file. I have to reopen the d-file. Knight e4 gets the knight back to a relatively civilized square, and we attack g7. We basically force the transition into the endgame. Now, if you take it on e3 first, who can tell me why this doesn't like win a lot of material? What is the important detail here? Knight takes d6 is correct, followed by queen takes e3, and white wins a piece. So that's an important detail. Now, in the endgame, white, just to reiterate, the sort of the fact that white is down 2 pawns is compensated by the fact that white has the rook on d7. I have control over the d-file. And his rooks are very, very passive. Now, when you turn on the computer, it gives a hefty advantage for black. But I would argue, I would have the audacity to argue that the reality is, from a blitz perspective, from a practical perspective, this is a difficult position to play for black. And I think you guys saw that manifest itself in the game. It's very hard. The computer knows exactly, how to wiggle its way out of things, and the computer is never afraid of piece activity. But humans are, and they should be. So knight d5 is already inaccurate according to the computer, which greedily prefers b6. Not an easy move to play, because basically you're supposed to allow this to happen and just trade one pair of rooks, rook a8. It all seems very obvious. It's like my game against Elshot, right? When you look at the game with a computer, you think you're an idiot. Really, and this persists all the way to the GM level. So it's a little bit depressing to do that. Take the computer suggestions with a grain of salt. No, you're not an idiot. You're not dumb. It's just that computers are so much better than humans ever will be. In my opinion, it's important to analyze with a computer insofar as it reveals mistakes, but you should certainly not take it as a sign that you suck or anything like that, because you do suck, and I suck, and Magnus sucks, and we all suck in comparison to computers. That doesn't mean we don't want to improve. Okay, and I didn't really follow my own advice because I hold myself to very high standards, but you guys should not do that to the same extent that I do it, in my opinion. So knight d5, rook takes b7, castles. Now, c4 would meet with knight e3, right? And I didn't want to give away a pawn for nothing, even though we do get a rook to d7. So that's why we play b3, preparing the move c4 and building up a pawn chain. At this point already, he's in trouble. Rook d7, getting the knight to g5. Why are we not worried that he opens up the a file? Because he doesn't have the other rook. And with only a rook and a knight, he can't create any chances. Now, knight takes c6 here. How does this idea work? So if f takes c6, this is a concept everybody should commit to memory. This mating idea is very common when you've got piggies on the 7th. Thank you, Joshua Yalday. But the problem is what? What does black have in this position? Yeah, I could have considered that Goran Zaric. That would have led to some really interesting complications. But he first takes g2. He defends the pawn preemptively. Now he takes c6. That is why I had to play g4. Now we have to escape the potential for a discovery, very patiently wiggling the king to c5. Now I can't take on e6, but I can take on f7. And knight takes h6 check is exactly the same concept. If he takes, check, check, and checkmate. At this point, we got into some time pressure, but the win is very straightforward. g5 to defend the knight. Win one pawn, get the knight over. Well, I could have taken the rook here, but it didn't matter. I'm completely winning at this point, winning the rook. And I actually managed to preserve reasonably good technique despite the time pressure, so I was quite happy with that. But you guys can see how quickly black's position deteriorated in that endgame. So what's the lesson from this? The lesson is you shouldn't automatically rule out an endgame even when you're down a bunch of pawns, right? Because there are certain endgames where the piece activity disparity is so vast that you might be even down 3 pawns. I can show you examples. You might be down a whole piece. And yet and that's rare, admittedly, but the disparity in piece activity is sometimes equally important, if not more important, than the material count. Thank you, Danny19. Loving the hype. Almost at 3,500. Amazing stuff, guys. Yeah, so rook b8 in this position. Well, then, yeah, maybe rook b8 would have been actually not so bad, but we would have gone knight c5, and he has a hard time defending these pawns. And any questions? Any other questions about this game? I think it was a complicated game, but hopefully I made everything relatively clear. Okay, looks like we're pretty clear. Let's play one more. If you guys are ready for the next one. And, oh, Damos, 1289, gifting 5. Thank you, my friend. Damos, 1289, raising that hype with the subs. And let's play a King's Indian. Let's go back to my home base. Let's play a King's Indian. And he plays what's called the Torre attack. The Torre attack is a similar opening to the London system, where white develops to f4. And in the Torre, white simply develops to g5. It's similar in spirit to the London. White does many of the same things. And logically, black also does many of the same things. So the great thing about the King's Indian, the reason I recommend it to a lot of players, is that you don't really have to modify your set of moves depending on what your opponent does. Which is not to say it's not theoretical. But if you understand the ideas, you can react reasonably to most things your opponent can throw at you. Theo 25k. So what do the King's Indian moves basically look like here? What should we do now? Should we go d5? That would be more Grunfeld style. Not really. If we want to preserve the King's Indian-ness of it, we should go d6. And as I've explained previously, in the King's Indian, black has 2 main pawn breaks, c5 and e5. In the Torre, one of the ideas is that white discourages e5 because he puts the bishop on g5 preemptively. Does it make sense, guys, that white's going to have this nasty pin if we go e5? So let's not fall into his plan. Let's actually punt on this. Let's table that conversation by finishing our development first. Let's look at this bishop for a second. Where can it go? Thank you, Archdruid and Tenacious. Where can this bishop go? What would be a nice, juicy, weighty square for that bishop? Not g4. If it goes to g4, guys, he's just going to take it away with h3. We're actually going to fianchetto it. In the interest of time, I'm going to make the move. We're going to fianchetto the bishop. And we're going to talk about this moment after. I don't expect people to just, like, know this stuff. Now, he wants to go a5, so we're going to go a5 ourselves to prevent him from doing that. And now we're going to develop the knight to d7. We don't want to develop it to c6 to obstruct the bishop. Now, he builds up a little battery here. Can we blunt that battery for now? Yeah, e6. Now, wait a second, I hear you guys saying, but doesn't that open up the pin? Well, it does. But guess what? That's not such a dangerous pin. We can get rid of it by playing g5 if we need to. I'm not saying we'll do that immediately. We can also get rid of the pin by moving the queen. And here I'm going to show you guys a really, really cool idea. Really, whoa, big for raid 127. We were doing, holy smokes. We had a dono. Chess Jacob, $100. Wow. Are you kidding me? And we are going to go G5. Let's get rid of the pin. Thank you, Bigfoot, for the raid. I can't even keep up with this. This is unbelievable levels of support, guys. What a raid. What a dono. Welcome, guys. We're doing the speedrun. Thank you so much, Chess Jacob. Now, how do we follow this move up? How do we get rid of this bishop? Yeah, knight h5 is the typical follow-up. I'll show you guys the cool idea afterwards. It didn't quite work here, but I'll show you guys afterward. This is amazing, guys. Not the way I played today, I didn't earn it, but I really appreciate it nonetheless. Now, what is going to be our strategy? Our strategy here, broadly speaking, is going to be to accumulate pieces on the king side. That's all we're going to do. Let's get our queen to f6. Slowly but surely, we're going to accumulate pieces on the queen side, and eventually, you know, at some point in the very distant future, we're going to try to play f5. Now, the situation has changed. He goes e5. He doesn't actually win a pawn. Why doesn't he win a pawn? What can we do here? What very important intermediate move does black have to play? Because if we take on d6, we actually drop the pawn. But we take the bishop. That's partially why we played knight h5. We take the bishop. And now we take the pawn. We're in pretty decent shape here. He's actually playing super, super well, this guy. Our position is a little bit precarious. Black has some weaknesses, but we also have the two bishops. Let's get the knight over to f6. Again, our plan is to accumulate pieces on the king side, and eventually we're going to launch into an attack. Now, one thing I'm noticing here is that when he took on g3 with the pawn, he weakened that h-file. So a potential idea is to go queen h5, knight g4. We don't have to do that immediately, but in fact, we actually can. Let's get the knight to g4. I don't see a downside to this move. Notice that when I play queen h5, I'm not going to be threatening queen h2, but his knight on f3 is going to be charged with a very heavy load. And we're going to start looking for some overloading tactics to try to get that knight out of f3. Also, don't forget about the bishop. That's why Wi-Fi and Keto did. It's occupying a really big diagonal, literally. Holy smokes! 30 on top of the 100 by Chess Jacob. We got 30 subs, ladies and gentlemen. That propels us over 5,500 subs. My land, girl. This is crazy. Let's trade the knights. Absolutely unbelievable. Thank you so much, Chess Jacob. This is incredible. And now we're going to start pushing the pawns. We're going to try to tear apart the defenses around his king. Amazing. Thank you so much. Over 5,500. Now we're going to go rook b8. Why did we play this move? Why did we play rook b8? And in the interest of time, I'm accelerating my pace a little bit here. But I want somebody on top of that Flonay with a sub. We're going to shut him down with d5. Somebody needs to give that man a sub. Thank you, Chess Jacob. Really appreciate it, man. We needed to protect b6, and we did that indirectly. He's not a sub. Unacceptable. Okay. Now, what happens if he takes the pawn on b6? This is where things get a little bit gnarly and complicated, but I'll walk you guys through this properly after the game. The bottom line is we're still trying to attack on the king side, and we're going to do that by pushing the pawns and trying to open up, trying to deal with Tommy gifting to Chess Jacob, trying to deal with his own pawns on the king side. That's going to let us pave the way for our pieces to come in and start attacking. So how specifically should we go about ripping this apart? This is an idea that I mentioned previously. Let's not forget about it. What was our initial idea? I said that we'd do this eventually. Yeah, f5, f4, let's go. Now, this is not that simple, right? Because we're weakening the e6 square. And that's a pretty serious weakness that we've created. It's right in the crosshairs of his rook. So a good move for him would be bishop d3. But I've judged that I'm going to, you know, kind of like an NFL blitz. I'm going to blitz this pawn up the board. And I've made the judgment call that he's not going to have the time to exploit the newly created weakness of e6. I don't know if that makes sense. That's basically my logic because I'm right on the doorstep of playing f4. And when I do, I just feel like his king is not going to survive very much longer. And I can always defend e6, worst comes to worst, by dipping my bishop to c8. Bad bishops defend good pawns. He plays f4 himself. Now, how should we take on Poussin? I'll give you guys a hint. We actually don't have to. He closed one freeway. But let's open the other freeway. We can take the other freeway. We can take the h-file. And here's the thing. In a certain sense, follow my logic here. It's actually a good thing. It's actually a good thing that he locked up the entire center, because this lets us fully focus on the other side of the board. Now we can divert all of our resources to the h file, including the bishop to h6, the queen to h4, and we don't have to worry about anything happening in the center, at least for the time being. And I actually just missed this move. I actually completely forgot I could do that. That's okay. You got to be able to recover in these situations. What do? You know what we do? Nothing. Let's first go queen h6. And here's what I've come up with. Okay, well, I've come up with winning his knight. He should have defended that pawn. This is the point I always make, though. When you put your opponent under pressure throughout the game, he gets tired. And that increases the probability of a blunder. I'll explain what I would have done if he had defended the pawn. I actually did miss king f2, to be completely fair. We have won a knight. Let's not relax too soon, because he can finally take e6. It's kind of funny. It's fitting that he has finally taken the pawn, but he's done it at the cost of a knight, and his entire king side has collapsed. Okay, thank you again, Chess Jacob, for the 30 gifted. We've had so many bombs today, so much support, so many donos, and I really, really appreciate it, guys. We are on the path to 6,000 subs. I cannot freaking believe it. Now, I'm looking at this bishop, and I'm saying, man, I really want this bishop on e3. That square would be really sexy. Can we get that bishop to e3? We can't play bishop h6, right? Wait a minute, can we get the bishop to h6? We can. You ask the Sam Shankland question. What happens if I do it anyway? Okay, we're definitely going to trade queens to simplify. Right? What happens if I do it anyway? If he had taken that rook, we would have had a fork with queen e3. I'll show this after the game. And that really is something I advocate for players of all levels, GMs, and, you know, all of my students receive a healthy dose of this suggestion basically at all times. Now, again, we've got some time pressure, so we just need to move the bishop away, dip the king to h8 so that we can, if necessary, block it with rook h7. Let's bring our bishop back. He's probably going to give us a check. We're going to go here. I actually, believe it or not, I did blunder. That's the funny thing. I blundered because I have to go rook g7. I forgot this bishop was hanging. Okay, and so did he. But he's going to lose on time. Sorry about that in the end. Nobody's perfect, however. So another very rich game. These people are playing very, very well. So he played the Torre attack. The Torre attack was named after Carlos Torre, Mexican, one of the strongest players to come out of Mexico. I think he basically flourished in the first half of the 20th century. And the first guy to play this was a guy named Coleman in 1923. Eugene Coleman, who lost against Richard Reti. And remember I mentioned Reti. Reti was one of the hyper-modernists. He was one of those guys in the 1920s who basically said, you don't have to play, he was a Czech player. He said you don't have to control the center of your pawns. It ain't a surprise to anybody that it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that Reti was playing the King's Indian in the 1920s when it was still unpopular. But then Torre himself, did he actually ever play the Torre in this move order? Let me see. It's one of those things, you know? Yeah, Torre did play it. Oh, but I think it's named after Eugenio Torre. Okay, this is really, really interesting, guys. So Torre refers to two players. Carlos Torre from Mexico. And much more recently, Eugenio Torre from the Philippines, one of the strongest grandmasters in the Philippines. He's still alive. He's in his 60s. I never knew this, but I think the Torre attack is named after Eugenio Torre from the Philippines, not Carlos Torre. It was around before Eugenio, but I think I see he's played it like over 20 times. So I actually think it's named after him and not Carlos Torre. Pretty interesting. That's a pretty recent thing. But anyway, nice little piece of trivia. Bishop g5, similar to the London. Castles, bishop c4. So normally in the Torre, white develops the bishop, I think, to d3 or e2. Bishop c4 is a slightly unusual way of developing. And d5 would be possible here with tempo, but we wanted to keep the King's Indian-ness of the line. So b6 to deploy the bishop. Now, why is bishop g4 not effective? Who can explain this to me succinctly? Why is bishop g4... I mean, usually we develop our bishop there. Why all of a sudden did I reject this natural developing square? Exactly, he goes h3. And the problem, guys, when we fianchetto our bishop, this bishop that we put on this diagonal doesn't have a retreat square. So we allow him to trap the bishop. And we would either have to take on f3, doesn't make sense, or bring the bishop back. Thank you, Super Scrub. So for that reason, we fianchetto the bishop. a4, a5, and e6 to blunt the battery. Now h6. And now I decided to just get rid of the pin. g5, not h5. Now, a little bit of decision logic. How did I decide that it was worth weakening the king side in this way? Like, isn't this very weakening to go g5? Well, as I've explained previously, the main aspect of the logic that I use is to figure out, okay, does white have the capacity in the next couple of moves to exploit the weakness of the king side? And what do I notice? His queen is on the queen side. His bishop's on the queen side. Most of his pieces are in some way clustered on the queen side, which means it's going to take him a long time to get them back to the king side. And in that time, I'm going to bring the beef to the king side, which I do on the next move. Does that make sense? So here e takes d6, we take on g3. And now we begin, what was the cool idea? So basically I had this idea, and I will show you guys a example in a similar position of where I applied this idea in one of my games. It's my favorite opening. It's, you know, people ask me about my favorite opening. Sometimes I roll my eyes at that question, but if I had to choose, it would definitely be the King's Indian. So you guys can see this game, the story behind this game. This is in this tournament in London in December. It was very cold. I got very, very sick in this tournament. I remember I had the flu. And at the time this game was played, I started getting that sore throat. You guys know when you get sick, it always starts with a sore throat for me. And the pain was getting excruciating. I mean, I was playing, and I was in agonizing pain. I couldn't swallow. But in this game, I was feeling that fever rising up, and I was basically playing a whole game delirious. But nonetheless, I managed to apply the idea. This is only round 1. It says round 2, but basically this is round 1. And then I actually did okay in the tournament given how sick I was. But this game I actually played quite well. And then I ran to my room and took all the medicine I could find, but it didn't help my throat. Okay, so this idea involves improving the queen. I'll give you guys a hint. You build a battery. Like, the ultimate end goal of this idea, which is 2 moves long, is to build a battery. Now, what kind of battery? Yeah, it was freezing. And then I went all around these Indian restaurants trying to get the spiciest curry to knock it out. Bingo. Rook a2, queen a1. Very typical idea, by the way. And ultimately, the idea is to build this battery along the long diagonal, which can be used to pressure it. Now, ultimately, it wasn't that simple. I got my queen back. You know, I remaneuvered my pieces. But look at how now the queen and the bishop are very nicely supervising the queenside pressure. I actually ended up playing a very, very nice game here. And that's the bottom line idea. Yeah, I've been on the whole time. But I've been doing... I went away for a little bit. And I will be playing Blitz as well. I'm feeling more energetic now. So that was the bottom line. But why didn't I do this here? The reason I didn't do this here, coming back to our speedrun scene, is that I was a little bit worried of him essentially rushing his pawn down the board, or he could go bishop d3, and I was not quite able to detect how I would apply more pressure on the pawn. But this has its time and place, but I thought this idea was quite a bit sexier. So now the next stage of the game begins, where we accumulate pieces on the king side, and we use our pawns as battering rams to shatter the defenses around his king. How do I know that I need to attack here? Well, I've already gotten my queen here, and I know that this bishop has a tremendous amount of potential energy. Tremendous amount of potential energy. And I know that if I'm able to open up files, I'll be able to use these pieces to my advantage. So h5, rook a, b8. Now this move, indirect defense of the pawn. What happens if queen takes b6? What specifically does black do in this position? Well, we got something. $5, not Danny 19. Thank you, my friend. Bishop takes g2 would be a very good move. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone, winning a pawn, and removing one of the defenders around his king. Take the juicer. Now we go d5. We keep the bishop on b7. Now, doesn't this close down the bishop? It does. But I judged that ultimately the bishop would be able to reroute via c8 or via a6. I wasn't too worried about this. So g4, here comes the f-pawn. So let's talk about my mistake. Now, basically, this move, queen h4, was very hasty. This move was very hasty. I just forgot that he can bring his king to f2. Now, what should we have done in this position instead? I think that I should have redid my move order here. It's actually not that simple. This idea of king f2 is quite an annoying one. I actually think that I rushed. I didn't practice what I preached. Now, if you guys know, yeah, bishop h6 preemptively. This is a very savvy move because if he plays king f2, now we take on g3 and he can't take with a knight. He has to take with a king. And at this point, black has a lot of different tactical ideas. We can consider a bishop sack. But whatever we do, this king is... Oh! Oh my god, I just saw something. I use the word sexy, and I mean it here. King g7 creates a beautiful threat. I think this works. Black to play and win. Black to play and win. Okay, let's let people think. The non-title players. Queen h4 and bishop f4. There's no defense, I think, against rook h8 checkmate. And if knight g, bishop f5, rook f6 though. Check. You sack one rook and you checkmate with the other one. That's actually quite a beautiful idea. I'm not sure this actually works, but it's oh, bishop takes f5 actually more. No, this wins. This actually wins. Wow, amazing. So that would have been quite the nice end to the game. And I just checked with the engine, but he ended up blundering the pawn. He should have gone queen d2, defending. And he actually gets the rook to h1, and actually white is more or less fine here. I was going to reroute my bishop and put it on h4. You get kind of some tension down the h4. I'm not sure who benefits from it. So this would have been quite complicated. I should not have allowed it, but all's well that ends well. He blunders the pawn, and the piece comes with it, and that's how we won. Ultimately, our attack succeeded, and we were able to stave off his central pressure. And that basically, you know, that is basically that.